All right, guys. Welcome to the first in a series of flip videos that I'm going to be using periodically throughout this year. And we're going to be starting off Chapter 18, the French Revolution and Napoleon. Here you see some imagery from that time period. The French Revolution, you look down at the bottom here, very dramatic period in French history. It lend itself to some very dramatic artwork later on as well. You see down here one of the symbols of the French Revolution, the guillotine. We'll be talking more about that later when we get to the Reign of Terror. This construct that they used to strap people down, and then this huge blade would come down and chop your head off. And then lastly, after the dust had settled of the revolution, the man that would step up and kind of lead France at this time was Napoleon Bonaparte. Okay, which would actually do away with an awful lot of the principles of the revolution, but bring France to greater heights than it had been in quite some time. So, section 1, beginnings of revolution. Causes first. All right. France was in rough shape on the eve of the revolution. We had 3 different estates or social classes, and this goes all the way back to medieval times. Right? In the Middle Ages, European society was very, very structured. There wasn't really much moving up or down. If you were a noble, you did not marry a peasant, and vice versa. But the 3 main estates in French society, one, you had the clergy. And the clergy are your priests, your bishops, cardinals, and so forth. They, even though they made up a very small part of the population, they made up a very powerful part of the population. So they are the first estate. The second estate, the nobles. And here you've got them in their hoity-toity dress. 1700s was big for frills. You see, just it looks like something that would take you an hour and a half to put on and out of. The guy's hair is done in more curls and longer than the girls. It's got the feathers, and the heels was another common thing. There was an awful lot of fashion in the 1700s that by today's standards, kind of modern mainstream society would consider to be effeminate, but it was considered to set them apart from the peasantry. And the third estate was mostly made up of peasants. All right, so you got the third estate down here, but it was also anybody who wasn't a part of the first or second estate. So it wasn't just peasants. You also had a group within the third estate that made up the middle class. So both of these guys were in the third estate. Big difference between the two, right? Here you've got your peasants, and over here on the right, you've got a group called the bourgeoisie. Again, it's pronounced bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie were your middle class. They were, many of them, educated. They were merchants, they were bankers, they were lawyers, and many of them could afford a very healthy lifestyle. The difference, though, is that they weren't old money. They didn't come from the old nobility of the second estate. And while many of them dressed an awful lot better than the peasants, they weren't wearing all the hoity-toity frills and fanciness of the second estate. So those are your 3 estates. Remember, first is the priests, the clergy. Second are the nobles. And the third is everybody else, but the peasants made up the majority of them. Now, I'll show you guys some statistics about it. Look at the middle column in each one. Look at the first one, okay, the one in black first. All right, so we got here, and then we got here. This is percent of total population. Look at the first estate. They're not even 1% of the population, the clergy, the priests. The second estate, the nobles, very, very small amount. The third estate, they make up everything. They're like 96, 97% of the overall population. And then you look at the percent of land owned. The first estate owns 10%. Second estate, like 25%. And the third estate, about 65%. So you think, well, the third estate owns 65%. That's not bad. That's more than half of it. Right, but look at it proportionately. The first estate is less than 1% of the total population, but they own 10% of the land. That's not good equity. Right? That's not fair. The third estate said, we make up almost the entire population. How is it that we don't have an overwhelming majority of the land? And another big issue that they had, look at this, percent of income paid taxes. First estate, practically nothing. The church, that was a deal that they worked out with the French government a long time ago. The church did not have to pay taxes. Second estate, they paid some, all right, but compared to the amount of land that they own, it's very, very minuscule. And the third estate paid a lot. Okay, percent of income paid in taxes. The third estate would have to pay 50% of their income in taxes, whereas the second estate barely had to pay anything, and the first estate didn't have to pay anything at all. So understandably, this made the members of the third estate pretty upset. And when you make up 96, 97% of the population, you're angering almost everybody. Gave rise to the belief that the third estate was completely being screwed over by the first and the second. And you saw political cartoons like this. Here you've got the clergy, the priest on the left. Here you've got the nobleman on the right, and they're standing on a rock with a peasant, or even doesn't necessarily have to be a peasant. It could be a member of the middle class, but being crushed underneath it. That they're bearing the burden. They're, kind of bearing all of it for France, while the first and second estate get off easy. Now, France was also in an economic crisis. They were involved in some very costly wars, the American Revolution being an example of one. They helped out the colonists against the British in the American Revolution, but it cost them a lot of money, and they had lost to Great Britain in the French-Indian War. You guys will learn more about that next year. Essentially, what it comes down to was they were kind of broke. They were engaged in deficit spending. I had you guys look at that with the vocab already. Deficit spending is when you are spending money you don't have. Right? Deficit is when you are in debt. So you just keep on spending money, but you don't have enough gold left in the reserves. And it's not good business. And then lastly, there was a very poor harvest. That was just bad luck. Crops died. They had very, very low intake of food, and it was going to lead to starvation. Not for these guys. Right, not for the first and the second estate. It was going to be for the third estate, the peasants down at the bottom, who were going to suffer because of that. Now, when you have financial problems, people are going to get upset, okay? And it would lead to wide-scale bread riots. The people of Paris and even the countryside, they took to the streets and they were demanding bread. They weren't demanding, tons of money. It was just basics. They said, we need bread to survive. King Louis XVI, he decided, all right, let's try and even out the tax burden a little bit. But the first and second estate just said, no, we're not doing that. This is the way that it's always worked, and we're not going to pay these taxes. Eventually, King Louis, that's him there, called a meeting of the Estates General. The Estates General was their legislative assembly. Remember, legislative bodies make the laws. And Louis, as you can see from the picture of him, was not exactly a man of the people. He was a nice guy. They said he wasn't a tyrant. He wasn't a mean guy, but he was not a very effective ruler. Was not beloved by the people. So he calls the Estates General. It was supposed to be from representatives of all three estates, but as you can imagine, it was always dominated by the first and the second estate. Proportionally, one person, one member from the first estate gets one vote. One person from the second estate gets one vote. You needed a whole crew of guys from the third estate that would equal one vote. So the third estate was always going to be outvoted, even though they made up the vast majority of the population. And eventually they decided, this is nonsense, we're not doing this anymore. So the members of the third estate, they go off and they form the National Assembly. Okay, again, these are members of the third estate. They said, we're going to do our own thing. If we're going to get screwed over by the first and the second estate, we're just not going to meet in the Estates General, and so we're going to form our own group. And some progressive members of the first and second estates eventually joined up with them and forced King Louis to start listening to what they had to say. And where they met to kind of declare this new thing was on a tennis court. So this became known as the tennis court oath. They said, they declared that we will, make sure that we have equal representation and that members of the third estate will be treated fairly and so forth. They swore never to separate and to use sound and just constitution. But again, they were kind of forcing the king to take notice at this point. What also forced the king to take notice was the storming of the Bastille. Now, the Bastille was this big medieval fortress in Paris. It was used as a fort when it was first made, kind of for warfare. Eventually, it was used as a prison. And it mostly housed political prisoners. Political prisoners are people that speak out against the government, that maybe conspire against the government. They're not necessarily people who are guilty of committing violent crimes like murder and robbery, but speaking out against the government in France at this time was a crime that you could go to jail for a very long time. And you were sent to the Bastille. Because of this, it represented the abuse of the upper class. It represented, the oppression of the third estate and the commoners, the peasants, the working class in the cities, and so forth. There were rumors going around that they had executed some prisoners in there. And after seeing what the third estate had done in forming the National Assembly, the citizens of Paris, the poorer citizens, the lower class citizens of Paris, they got all riled up, and they decided that they're going to storm the Bastille, that they're going to take it. So on July 14th, 1789, a mob of peasants took it over. You hear as they're running in, and they went in kind of thinking they were going to take all of the weapons and so forth. They did release some of the prisoners. They killed the commander. There really wasn't anything there, but it was a symbolic gesture. It was a symbolic gesture that the people were not going to sit idly by and allow their government to oppress them anymore. And that scared the king. That scared the first and the second estate as well. And it made them recognize that something has to be done. Okay, so we'll wrap that up for the first video. And that's pretty much it for section 1 of this chapter. And we can go on to the next one where we'll talk about the next phase of the revolution in the next video.